Sometime in the early 1980s, prior to that time, all the pistachios, virtually all the pistachios in the world, all came from Iran. Iran got in a lot of trouble with the U.S. The net result of that was that the supply of pistachios in the world got interrupted. So I happened to know a guy named Bob Robeson. He had just sold his interest in an electronic watch company. So he said, this looks like a good time for me to start another company. So he bought 640 acres of land out by Chowchilla, out in the Central Valley, and he started raising pistachios. I got a call one day from a mutual friend who said, I just talked to Bob and he wanted to know if either of us knew how to spray herbicide on the weeds in his pistachio grove selectively so he didn't waste so much by spraying it on the bare ground. And I said, yeah, you could probably do that. I'm sure optically you could detect a weed and, therefore spray a little Roundup on the weed, but not sprayed on the bare ground. I was working for Siemens at the time. I didn't want to take the time, and I knew Siemens wouldn't have any interest in such a project. So the idea went in one ear, but it didn't come out the other. It stayed in there. A few years later, I got tired of working for a big company like Siemens. That idea popped back into my mind, so I went off and developed a technology that allowed a small box, no bigger than a telephone, really, to be able to look at the ground and see weeds and discriminate between a weed that's growing and one that's dead, or a weed that's not a weed, that's a corn plant or a cotton plant or something. So I ended up developing the technology here in this room, literally. At one point we had 7 people working in here, 4 or 5 engineers and some technicians and a purchasing guy, and I think in total we built around 100 systems and sold them mostly to wine growers because they were some of the few people, and nut growers, who could afford such technology. Because this is pretty expensive at the time. A little thing this big was like $1,000. Yeah, so the only people who could afford that would be wine growers at the time were very rich, and pistachio growers and walnut growers and almond growers were you couldn't sell that kind of technology in a cornfield because there's not enough margin to justify the saving. But it saved like 2/3 of the herbicide that were getting wasted were conserved. This was basically the electronics lab, so you see lots of PC boards and various discrete components, and there's a power supply and all the things you need to build circuits and debug circuits. There were some competing technologies in existence at the time, and what you want to do is be able to look at the floor of an orchard, let's say, or a cornfield or whatever, and when you see a weed, you want to direct some herbicide to flow onto the weed. There's a couple of ways you could do that. You could use morphology, in other words, measure the size and shape of a leaf and therefore determine what that plant was by that information. That would require enormous amounts of computer horsepower. Keep in mind, this is 30 years ago. It was not practical at the time to try to solve this problem using leaf morphology. I said, how about we use spectral reflectance? By that I mean we have a silicon photodetector that can see from around about 400 nanometers up in through the near infrared up to 1200 or so, maybe a little higher, nanometers of the spectrum. So the entire visible spectrum, a little bit in the UV, quite a bit in the near infrared. You can see that entire thing with an inexpensive silicon photodetector. And coincidentally, you can also make LEDs at those various wavelengths through that whole thing. So I happened to be in the LED business at the time with Siemens. I theorized that if you could study the reflection from living chlorophyll-bearing plant tissue, you would probably find a unique color signature for various different kinds of plants. And sure enough, that turns out to be true. First of all, the chlorophyll molecule, actually there are 2 chlorophyll molecules, but they're only a couple of nanometers apart in terms of their reflection, so very strong absorption. Also, turns out that all things organic, whether they've lived or in the past or are still living, they tend to reflect very strongly in the near infrared. So beyond about 700 nanometers or so, you get a very strong reflection. So think about that. You got a strong absorption at 672 nanometers, and at 700 nanometers, you got a very strong reflection. Well, you can detect that slope easily with a combination of some silicon photodetectors and a little bit of computer horsepower, and identify a living plant. So that was the first step, and so we used that concept to develop the first Weedseeker, as we called it. I was doing research about how in the world we could do this using light, and I ran across an article written by some guy at the USDA in Washington. So I called him up one day, and he said, "Yeah, come on out. I'll explain to you how we do this." So what he was doing at the time, they were flying these reconnaissance airplanes over Russia and photographing their wheat fields, because they were selling a lot of wheat into Europe at that time. So they wanted to know how much the Russian wheat crop was going to produce. So they were doing this by flying over there and taking pictures. So I went to see him in Washington, and he introduced me for the first time to the spectrum that plants care about. Photosynthetic spectrum. Everything from about 400 nanometers up to 700 nanometers. They were using infrared cameras then, 700 and above, to be able to look at the ground and see how healthy the wheat field was, basically. So he sent me to a guy named James Hanks at the Stoneville, Mississippi Advanced Research Center of the USDA. Well, Stoneville, Mississippi is right on the Mississippi River, and they grow lots and lots of soybeans and corn and cotton. So I went down there and saw James Hanks. So he liked that idea a lot. So he helped me. We made application to the USDA, kind of a program that provided investment capital to research agriculture. James and I made this application, won a grant of $50,000 to study the spectral reflectance of these various crop plants and all the weeds associated with those crops. Developed a technology that was capable actually of not only discriminating between a weed in the bare ground, but also looking at a cotton plant and a pigweed right next to each other, and you can tell the difference by the spectral reflectance.
Wow. So
that was the basis that got John Deere excited enough that I was able to sell a company to them. So, that took about 4 years altogether. And then I sold the entire company to John Deere, patents and everything. They used it for 2 or 3 years. They quickly realized that kind of technology was really counter to their long-term interest, because the alternative to controlling weeds with herbicides and saving herbicide, their alternative was to drag cultivators through the fields. And to use these cultivators, you need big tractors, and that's what John Deere did. So they ended up literally giving the company away to one of their dealers in Ukiah with the promise that this company would not compete with them in row crops. So they were able to sell the equipment into orchards and vineyards, which they did. That company started coming apart. It was sold to Trimble, the original pioneer in the GPS business. Trimble Navigation is the name of the company, and they still own it today. If you open up a Trimble catalog today, you'll see the exact product that I developed in 1992 still being produced.